The smell of motor oil and sawdust had settled into the walls of that garage like a memory that refuses to fade. I can still feel the weight of the wrench in my hand as I work the stubborn latch on the old wooden door, the metal cold against my palm despite the warmth of the September evening. Each turn of the screw felt deliberate, necessary, as if fixing this simple thing could somehow fix everything else that felt broken and unnamed in my life. Lucas stood 10 feet away, leaning against my workbench in that casual way of his, close enough that when I shifted my weight, our sleeves would brush. Close enough that I could hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing between the distant sounds of laughter from the house. The guys were in there, gathered around the kitchen table for our monthly poker night, their voices carrying through the thin walls in waves of good-natured arguing and the occasional burst of genuine amusement. I had stepped out here to escape the cigarette smoke and the endless rehashing of last weekend's game, telling myself I needed to fix this latch that had been sticking for months. But that wasn't entirely true. The truth was something I couldn't name yet, something that lived in the space between Luca's presence and my own restless need to be near him. He watched me work with those dark eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of the overhead light. There was something patient about the way he waited, something that suggested he understood the real reason we were both standing in this dim garage while our friends played cards without us. When I glanced up from the door, I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something soft and questioning that made my chest tighten. The latch finally gave way with a satisfying click, and I straightened, wiping my hands on the old rag I kept draped over the toolbox. The silence between us felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the simple act of fixing something had somehow broken something else open. Luca pushed himself away from the workbench and moved closer, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne mixed with the beer he'd been nursing all evening. His hand found my arm, just above the elbow, and his touch lingered there a moment longer than it should have. A second too long for friendship. A second that changed the air between us into something electric and dangerous. He leaned in then, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and said the words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. "Don't tell the guys." The way he said it was playful on the surface, with that half-smile that had become so familiar to me over the past year. But underneath the lightness, I heard something else entirely. A dare, maybe, or a warning, or perhaps an invitation to step into territory that neither of us had acknowledged existed until that moment. Before I could respond, before I could even process what his words meant or what my answer might be, he was already moving away, already walking back toward the house where the sound of our friends' laughter seemed suddenly distant and foreign. The overhead light cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and I stood there alone among my tools and projects, surrounded by the familiar smell of old wood and machine grease, trying to name the feeling that had settled in my chest like a weight I didn't know how to carry. That night in the garage feels like a turning point now, but at the time it was just another moment in the careful architecture of my life. I was 36 then, settled into routines that had calcified over the years into something that resembled contentment if you didn't look too closely. Every morning I kissed Evelyn goodbye at the kitchen counter while she packed lunchboxes for the kids. Every evening I came home to the same conversations about Sarah's science project or Michael's struggles with algebra, about the rising cost of groceries, and whether we could afford to fix the leak in the upstairs bathroom this month or if it would have to wait until spring. Evelyn and I had been married for 12 years. We met in college, dated through our early 20s, and married because it felt like the natural next step in a sequence we both understood. She was practical and kind, with soft brown hair that she wore pulled back when she was focused on something important. She managed the household finances with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, keeping spreadsheets for our monthly expenses and maintaining a running list of home improvements that we never quite seemed to get around to completing. The kitchen tiles were still chipped along the baseboard where the previous owners had removed a dishwasher. Evelyn mentioned replacing them every few months, usually while standing at the sink doing dishes, her voice carrying that particular tone of resigned patience that meant she knew it wouldn't happen anytime soon. I always agreed that we should look into it, and then somehow the conversation would drift to other things, other expenses, other priorities that seemed more urgent in the moment. Our house sat on a street that curved gently through a neighborhood built in the 70s, where every yard had the same narrow maple trees and the same mailboxes painted in variations of black and brown. I knew which houses belonged to which families, whose dog barked at joggers in the early morning, which neighbor always forgot to bring in their garbage cans on time. It was the kind of place where you could live for decades and never feel surprised by anything. Never have to question the shape of your days or wonder what might exist beyond the comfortable boundaries you'd established. I worked in construction management for a company that built strip malls and office complexes throughout the county. It was steady work that paid well enough to keep us comfortable, and I was good at it. I understood materials and timelines, could read blueprints and coordinate crews without losing my temper when things went wrong. The men I worked with respected me because I could handle myself on a job site, because I knew when to push back against unrealistic deadlines and when to find creative solutions to budget constraints. But it was the group that met in my basement every month that felt like the real center of my social world. These were men I'd known since my early 20s, a collection of high school friends and old work buddies who had somehow stayed connected through marriages and divorces, job changes and crosstown moves. There was Danny, who managed an auto parts store and still told the same stories about his glory days playing football. There was Mike, an electrician with 3 kids who always brought beer in cans because he said bottles were pretentious. There was Tom, recently divorced, who had started joining us more frequently since his ex-wife moved out and took the dog. We gathered in my basement because it was the only space large enough for our monthly poker games. I had finished it myself over the course of several weekends, installing drop ceiling tiles and laying down industrial carpet that could handle spilled drinks and cigarette ash. The lighting was unforgiving fluorescent strips, but it served its purpose. We could be loud down there without waking the kids, could smoke and swear and act like the younger versions of ourselves without having to worry about setting a good example. Luca had been coming to these games for about a year. He was a friend of Danny's, someone who had moved to town for work and was looking to meet people. I remember the first time Danny brought him, how he hung back initially, watching the rhythm of our conversation before joining in. He was different from the rest of us in ways that were hard to define. Quicker with a smile, but often unreadable when he thought no one was paying attention. He had a way of asking questions that made you think more carefully about your answers, and he never seemed to feel the need to fill every silence with words. When it was just the two of us, which happened more often than I initially noticed, he became quieter, more thoughtful. The easy charm he displayed with the group would shift into something more genuine, more direct. He would ask about my work, about the projects I was managing, and actually listen to my answers with the kind of attention that made me realize how rarely anyone asked me about things I cared about. The garage had become my refuge over the years, the one space in the house that belonged entirely to me. I kept it organized with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive, every tool in its designated place, every project sorted and labeled. Evelyn rarely came out there except to remind me that dinner was ready or to ask if I'd seen her car keys. It was where I went when I needed to think, when the conversations about mortgage payments and school schedules began to feel like they were happening to someone else. I had started noticing how often Luca found reasons to follow me out there during our gatherings. He would offer to help carry something, or mention that he needed to check on his car, or simply step outside for air and somehow end up leaning against my workbench while I puttered around with whatever project was currently claiming my attention. These moments felt different from our interactions with the group, charged with a kind of energy that I didn't have words for yet. Looking back now, I can see how carefully we were both navigating around something neither of us was ready to acknowledge. How we created these small opportunities to be alone together while maintaining the fiction that our friendship was no different from any of the others in our circle. How we both seemed to understand, without ever discussing it, that whatever was building between us existed in the spaces between our normal lives, in the shadows of my garage, and the quiet moments when the rest of the world felt very far away. It began with the smallest of requests. Luca called on a Thursday evening in October, his voice carrying that casual tone that suggested the idea had just occurred to him. He was moving some furniture around in his apartment, he said, and wondered if I might have a dolly he could borrow. Nothing urgent, just when I had a chance. I found myself saying yes before I'd even considered whether I actually owned a dolly, let alone whether lending it was convenient. There was something about the way he asked, something that made refusing feel impossible. I told him I'd drop it by after work the next day, and spent the entire drive to his place wondering why such a simple favor felt so significant. His apartment was on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, the kind of place that managed to feel both cramped and charming at the same time. When he opened the door, I could see boxes stacked in the living room and a couch angled awkwardly away from the wall. He looked genuinely relieved to see me, and before I knew it, I was inside helping him shift a bookshelf from one corner to another, then adjusting the placement of a coffee table that didn't quite fit anywhere. What should have taken 20 minutes stretched into 2 hours. We worked with an easy rhythm, testing different configurations of his furniture while talking about nothing particularly important. He made coffee, and we stood in his kitchen, and I found myself noticing details I had no business paying attention to. The way his shirt pulled across his shoulders when he reached for mugs in the cabinet. The careful way he arranged books on the shelf we'd just moved, grouping them by some system that seemed to make sense only to him. The requests became more frequent after that. He needed to borrow a socket wrench set. He wondered if I might take a look at a loose bathroom faucet that his landlord kept promising to fix. Each time, I said yes too quickly, and each time I stayed longer than necessary, finding myself reluctant to leave even when the task was finished. The evening that changed everything happened in November. Luca called to invite me over to check out the new grill he'd bought, a small gas unit he'd managed to fit on his back porch. He was planning to cook steaks, he said, and thought I might want to join him. Test out the new equipment. Nothing fancy, just dinner between friends. I told Evelyn I was going to help Luca with something, which wasn't exactly a lie. She barely looked up from the homework she was helping Sarah with, waving me away with a distracted smile and reminding me not to stay out too late. The ease with which the deception came surprised me, as did the relief I felt at having an excuse to spend an evening away from the familiar routines of home. Luca's back porch was barely large enough for 2 chairs and the small grill, but it overlooked a narrow yard bordered by maple trees that had turned brilliant orange in the autumn light. He had set the table with actual plates and cloth napkins, an attention to detail that seemed both thoughtful and somehow intimate in a way that made me nervous. We talked while the steaks cooked, about work and weather and the upcoming holidays, but gradually the conversation deepened into territory we'd never explored before. He told me about growing up in Ohio, about parents who had expected him to follow his father into accounting and his decision to move here instead, to try something different. I found myself sharing things I rarely discussed with anyone, about the projects I'd always wanted to build, about the feeling that my life had somehow become smaller than I'd intended it to be. The steaks grew cold while we talked. By the time we thought to check on them, they were overcooked and tough, but neither of us seemed to care. We ate them anyway, laughing about our complete failure as chefs, and then continued talking as the sun set, and the porch light cast everything in warm yellow tones. There were moments during that evening that I couldn't shake afterward. The way his hand rested briefly on my shoulder when he leaned over to refill my wine glass. How he stood close enough in the narrow kitchen that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body when we cleaned up together. The way our laughter would sometimes dissolve into silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward, spaces between words that neither of us felt compelled to fill with unnecessary conversation. When I finally left, well past midnight, he walked me to my car and stood beside the driver's door while I fumbled with my keys. For a moment, I thought he might say something, might acknowledge the weight of whatever had shifted between us during those hours on his porch. Instead, he simply thanked me for coming, his voice softer than usual, and told me to drive safely. I drove home through empty streets, my mind replaying every moment of the evening, every casual touch and meaningful glance. Evelyn was already asleep when I slipped into bed beside her, and I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening to me. The pattern continued through the winter months. Small invitations that led to longer conversations, moments of physical proximity that felt charged with significance I couldn't name. I began to anticipate these encounters with an intensity that scared me, checking my phone more frequently for his messages, finding excuses to drive past his apartment on my way to job sites. Then, in March, Danny announced that he'd booked a cabin for a long weekend in April. It was something we'd talked about doing for years, but never quite organized. A chance for the whole group to get away together for fishing and cards, and the kind of bonding that was easier to accomplish away from the responsibilities of daily life. I should have been excited about the trip. These men were my closest friends, and the idea of 3 days in the mountains with nothing to do but relax should have appealed to me. Instead, I felt a restless energy that had nothing to do with anticipation and everything to do with the knowledge that Luca would be there, that we would be in close quarters for days, sleeping in the same cabin, sharing meals and conversations without the familiar boundaries of our usual interactions. When I mentioned the trip to Evelyn, she encouraged me to go with an enthusiasm that made me feel guilty. "You never take time for yourself," she said, looking up from the bills she was sorting at the kitchen table. "It'll be good for you to get away with the guys for a few days." The ease with which she dismissed the idea of my absence stung more than it should have, but I found myself agreeing, committing to 3 days that I knew would either resolve the tension that had been building between Luca and me or make it impossible to ignore it any longer. The cabin sat nestled among pine trees an hour north of the city, a rustic structure that Danny had found through a friend of a friend who used it for hunting season. It was more primitive than I'd expected, with thin walls that barely contained sound and a wood-burning stove that required constant attention to keep the main room warm. The bedrooms were small and spartanly furnished, and the kitchen consisted of a refrigerator that hummed too loudly and a gas stove with burners that lit with an alarming whoosh of flame. But there was something liberating about being there, away from the familiar rhythms of home and work, surrounded by nothing but trees and the distant sound of a stream that wound its way through the valley below. The first day passed in the easy camaraderie I'd expected, with fishing in the morning and cards in the afternoon, the kind of relaxed conversation that comes when men have nowhere else to be and nothing pressing to accomplish. As evening approached, the group settled into patterns that revealed themselves slowly. Danny appointed himself chef and took charge of the grill outside, seasoning steaks with the confidence of someone who'd clearly been planning this moment for months. Mike found a spot at the picnic table where he could simultaneously play cards and keep an eye on the cooler of beer, rationing out cans with the seriousness of a bartender managing a difficult crowd. Tom, still adjusting to his newly single status, drank more than usual and talked louder than necessary, as if the volume of his voice could somehow fill the spaces his divorce had left empty. And Luca seemed content to observe, participating when drawn into conversation, but often letting his attention drift to the fire or the darkening sky, or the way shadows moved across the clearing as night settled around us. I found myself watching him more openly than I would have dared to at home, noting the way firelight caught the angles of his face, the relaxed set of his shoulders in the old flannel shirt he'd brought for the trip. The nights stretched longer than they did in the city, without the distractions of television or the subtle pressure to wind down early because of work the next morning. We stayed up past midnight each night, drinking beer and telling stories that grew more embellished with each retelling, playing poker with stakes low enough that losing didn't matter and winning felt purely symbolic. But something else was happening in the spaces between the group activities, in the moments when conversation lulled or when someone went inside for another beer or stepped away to relieve themselves in the woods. Luca and I began to find each other in these intervals, drawn together by something that felt both inevitable and carefully orchestrated. The second night, after the others had grown loud with alcohol and the competitive edge of the card game had sharpened into good-natured arguments about past hands and future strategies, I stepped outside to get some air. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the bench beside it offered a view of stars that were invisible from my suburban backyard. Luca joined me there within minutes, settling beside me with enough space between us to maintain the appearance of casual friendship, but close enough that when he shifted his weight, his knee would brush against mine. The contact was brief, ostensibly accidental, but it happened too often to be coincidental. Each touch sent a charge through me that I tried to ignore, focusing instead on the distant sound of our friend's laughter from inside the cabin. He told me things that night that he'd never shared before, speaking quietly so his voice wouldn't carry through the thin walls. About the long-term relationship he'd left behind in Ohio, a partnership that had lasted nearly 5 years before ending not in anger, but in a kind of mutual recognition that they were both living lives that didn't quite fit. He didn't specify the details, didn't name the gender of his former partner, but something in the way he said it, not the kind you'd expect, made me understand that there were layers to his history that I was only beginning to glimpse. I found myself sharing my own stories in return, talking about the dreams I'd had in my 20s that had somehow gotten buried under the practical necessities of marriage and mortgage payments. About projects I'd planned to build, places I'd thought about traveling, versions of myself that had never quite materialized. The words came easier in the darkness, with the warmth of the dying fire on our faces and the comfortable distance from our everyday lives. As the weekend progressed, the physical boundaries between us began to blur in ways that felt both terrifying and inevitable. When we walked single file along the narrow path to the stream, his hand would find the small of my back to guide me around obstacles or through low-hanging branches. When we sat together on the couch inside the cabin, watching the others play cards, he would rest his hand on my knee while making a point in conversation, the touch lasting just long enough to feel deliberate. These moments were brief, masked as casual gestures that could be dismissed as the kind of physical familiarity that develops between friends in close quarters. But they were also intentional, charged with an energy that I began to anticipate with an intensity that surprised me. I started positioning myself in ways that would create opportunities for these accidental touches, sitting where he was likely to join me, volunteering for tasks that would require us to work together. The transformation was happening in me as well as between us. I began to notice things about my own responses that I'd never acknowledged before. The way my pulse quickened when he entered a room. The particular attention I paid to his laugh, to the way he moved his hands when he talked, to the moments when his guard dropped and his expressions became unguarded. I started to understand that what I'd been calling friendship had always contained elements that had nothing to do with friendship at all. On the final night, after the others had drunk enough to become sentimental and nostalgic, sharing stories about their younger selves with the kind of emotional openness that alcohol sometimes facilitates, Tom and Mike and Danny eventually stumbled off to their respective bedrooms, leaving Luca and me alone in the main room with the dying fire and the detritus of the evening's celebration. The silence that settled between us felt different from the comfortable quiet we'd shared on previous nights. There was something expectant in it, something that suggested we were both aware that our time at the cabin was nearly over and that whatever had been building between us over these 3 days was approaching some kind of conclusion. Lucas stood first, mentioning that he wanted to bring in more firewood before we let the fire die completely. He asked if I wanted to help, and I followed him out into the cool night air, across the clearing to the shed where Danny had stacked split logs earlier in the week. Inside the small wooden structure, we worked by the light of a flashlight Luca had brought, loading our arms with pieces of oak and pine that would burn slowly through the rest of the night. When we reached for the same log, our hands touched, and neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact was electric, sending awareness shooting up my arm and into my chest where it settled like a weight I didn't know how to carry. He looked at me, then with an intensity I'd never seen before, his gaze holding mine in the dim light of the shed. I felt both completely exposed and somehow protected by the darkness, as if the normal rules of our friendship had been suspended in this small space where no one could see us and nothing from our regular lives could intrude. The moment stretched between us, filled with possibilities I didn't have words for yet, until the sound of Tom's voice calling from the cabin broke the spell and reminded us that we existed in a world that extended beyond this clearing, beyond these 3 days, beyond whatever was happening in the charged space between our bodies and our carefully maintained boundaries. The last night arrived with a suddenness that caught me off guard, as if the weekend had been moving toward this moment with an inevitability I hadn't fully understood until it was upon us. We'd spent the day fishing with limited success, more focused on the easy rhythm of casting lines and the comfortable silences that had become natural between us than on actually catching anything worth keeping. By evening, a light rain had begun to fall, the kind of steady drizzle that turns the world soft around the edges and makes everything feel more intimate. Danny had declared the outdoor grill unusable and moved the cooking inside, where the small kitchen became crowded with too many bodies and too much good-natured arguing about the proper way to season fish. I'd escaped the chaos by volunteering to check on the small boathouse down by the stream, where Danny had mentioned earlier that one of the door latches was coming loose. The boathouse was hardly more than a shed built on a small dock that extended into the water, but it housed the canoe and fishing equipment that came with the cabin rental. The latch in question was on the main door, a simple metal mechanism that had worked itself loose from the wooden frame over what looked like years of use and weather. I was bent over the door, adjusting the screws with a multi-tool I'd brought from my tackle box, when I heard footsteps on the wooden planks behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Luca. I'd become attuned to the particular rhythm of his walk, the way he moved with just enough deliberation to suggest he'd chosen to be wherever he was. He said he'd come to help, though we both knew the repair was simple enough for one person. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, close enough that I could feel his presence like heat against my back while I worked. The rain drummed steadily on the roof above us, creating a cocoon of sound that seemed to separate us from the rest of the world. When I straightened up to test the latch, he was closer than I'd expected, close enough that when I turned, our bodies were separated by inches rather than the careful feet we'd maintained all weekend. The air between us felt charged with something that had been building for months, maybe longer, though I was only now beginning to name it. Our breath was visible in the cool air, small clouds that dissipated in the space between us. He was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something vulnerable and certain at the same time. For a moment, neither of us moved, and I felt suspended in that space where anything could happen and everything could change. His hand moved first, rising slowly to brush against mine where it still held the multi-tool. The contact was deliberate this time, no pretense of accident or casual friendship. His fingers traced across my knuckles with a tenderness that made my chest tighten, and I felt something shift inside me, some barrier I'd maintained without knowing it was there. He leaned closer then, not quite close enough to call it a kiss, but near enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my cheek. Close enough that the space between us became charged with possibility, with the weight of everything we'd been carefully not saying to each other for months. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of rain and the distant murmur of our friends' voices from the cabin. I felt my heart beating hard enough that I was certain he could hear it, and for a moment I thought he might close the distance between us entirely, might make the choice that I couldn't bring myself to make. Instead, he stayed where he was, close enough to kiss but not kissing, letting the moment exist in that liminal space where desire and restraint balanced on a knife's edge. The tension became unbearable, charged with years of careful boundaries and unspoken understanding. I heard myself speak before I decided to say anything, my voice sounding strange in the small space between us. "You keep finding reasons to touch me." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they carried the weight of every casual contact, every seemingly accidental brush of hands or shoulders, every moment when he'd stood just a little too close for friendship. He didn't smile this time, didn't deflect with the easy charm he usually employed when conversations threatened to become too serious. Instead, his expression grew more serious, more vulnerable, as if my words had stripped away some pretense he'd been maintaining. "Maybe I don't need a reason," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough that I felt the words settle into my bones. There was something fragile in the way he said it, as if he were offering me something precious that I could either accept or destroy with my response. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy with it, and for a moment the small boathouse seemed to tilt around us. I realized that I was standing at the edge of something that would change everything, that whatever I said or did next would determine not just what happened between Luca and me, but what happened to the life I'd built, the identity I'd constructed, the future I'd always assumed was inevitable. And in that moment, with the rain falling around us and his breath warm against my face, I felt something settle in my chest that I'd been fighting against for longer than I could remember. The terrifying, liberating truth that I wanted this. Not just his touch, not just this moment of connection, but the life it implied. A life where I didn't have to perform, where I could stop pretending to be satisfied with the comfortable boundaries I'd established, where I could acknowledge desires I'd spent years refusing to name. The realization hit me with a force that made me step back slightly, not away from him, but into myself, into an understanding that felt both foreign and completely familiar. I wanted this man, wanted him with an intensity that frightened me. But more than that, I wanted the version of myself that existed in his presence, the person I became when the careful armor of my daily life fell away. The sound of voices from the cabin grew louder, reminding us that we existed in a world beyond this small wooden structure, beyond this moment of revelation. Lucas seemed to hear it too, because he stepped back, creating space between us that felt both necessary and impossible to bear. We stood there for a long moment, looking at each other in the dim light filtering through the rain-streaked windows, both of us understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The careful dance we'd been performing for months had led us to this point, and there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that we were simply friends who enjoyed each other's company. When we finally returned to the cabin, carrying ourselves with the careful casualness of people who have just crossed a line they can't uncross, the others were too focused on their card game and their drinks to notice the change in us. But I felt it in every movement, every glance, every moment when our eyes met across the room. The knowledge that tomorrow we would return to our separate lives, but we would never again be able to pretend that what existed between us was anything as simple as friendship. Returning home felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit properly. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The same chipped kitchen tiles, the same stack of bills on the counter, the same routine of dinner and homework and bedtime stories. But I moved through it all like an actor who'd forgotten his lines, going through motions that felt increasingly foreign with each passing day. Evelyn greeted me with genuine enthusiasm, asking about the fishing and whether the guys had behaved themselves, listening to my carefully edited stories about the weekend with the kind of attention that made my deception feel heavier. She looked tired, I noticed, in the way that comes from managing 2 children and a household alone for 3 days. But she was happy to have me home, happy to return to the familiar rhythm of shared responsibilities. She had plans, she told me over dinner that first night back. She wanted to repaint the bedroom, had been looking at color samples while I was away, and thought maybe a soft gray would make the space feel larger. The kids had been arguing about television privileges, and she wanted to establish a better system for screen time that wouldn't require constant negotiation. Small domestic concerns that should have felt important but instead seemed to be happening to someone else, someone whose life I was observing from a great distance. I found myself nodding and responding appropriately, but my mind kept drifting back to the boathouse, to the weight of Luca's words and the way the space between us had felt charged with possibility. I would catch myself in the middle of conversations, realizing that Sarah had asked me something about her science project or that Michael needed help with a math problem, and I would have to ask them to repeat themselves because I'd been somewhere else entirely. The moments from the cabin played on loop in my head with an intensity that surprised me. Not just the final night in the boathouse, but all of it. The way he'd looked at me across the fire, the casual touches that had felt like electric shocks, the conversations that had revealed depths I hadn't known existed in either of us. I found myself replaying his words over and over. Maybe I don't need a reason, spoken with that vulnerability that had cut straight through every defense I'd constructed. I started avoiding the group gatherings, making excuses about work deadlines and family obligations that weren't entirely false, but weren't entirely true either. When Danny called about the next poker night, I begged off, claiming Evelyn had planned something I couldn't get out of. When Mike invited everyone to his backyard barbecue, I said I'd promised to take the kids to their grandmother's house that weekend. But avoiding Luca specifically proved impossible in a circle of friends as small as ours. When he called one evening to ask if he could borrow my circular saw for a project, I found myself saying yes before I could think better of it, then spending the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation that felt more appropriate to a first date than a simple tool loan. He arrived just after dinner, when Evelyn was helping Sarah with homework at the kitchen table and Michael was absorbed in a video game in the living room. I met him in the garage, where the familiar smell of motor oil and sawdust felt different now, charged with the memory of that night when he'd told me not to tell the guys. I handed him the saw and its accessories, explaining how to adjust the blade depth and where the safety mechanisms were located, information he probably already knew, but that gave us both something to focus on besides the tension that had settled between us like a third presence. When the practical conversation ended, we stood there in the fluorescent light, surrounded by my carefully organized tools and projects, and I realized that all my careful avoidance had accomplished nothing. The pull I felt toward him was stronger than ever, intensified by the days of trying to pretend it didn't exist. He looked at me with that direct gaze I'd grown to anticipate and dread in equal measure, and I knew he wasn't going to let me continue hiding behind the fiction that nothing had changed between us. "You're not the kind of man who can keep living in half-light," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the enclosed space. The words hit me with the force of absolute truth, cutting through every rationalization I'd constructed over the past weeks. He was right, and we both knew it. I wasn't built for the kind of compartmentalization that would allow me to go back to the way things had been before the cabin, before I'd understood what I wanted, before I'd felt the weight of his hand against mine and realized that everything I'd thought I knew about myself was incomplete. The choice sat heavy in my chest, a physical weight that made breathing difficult. I could see the life that lay ahead if I stepped back from this moment, if I returned the saw and thanked him for understanding and went back into the house where my family waited. Years of careful pretense, of performing satisfaction with a life that felt increasingly like a costume I wore for other people's benefit. But I could also see the other path, the one that started with acknowledging what I felt for this man who stood before me with infinite patience, waiting for me to find the courage to be honest about who I was and what I wanted. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I moved through my days like a man underwater, going through the motions of normalcy, while feeling fundamentally changed by the understanding that I could no longer ignore. Evelyn began to notice the distance, asking if I was feeling well, if something was bothering me at work, if I needed to see a doctor about my obvious distraction. The conversation I'd been avoiding finally came on a Thursday evening in May. Evelyn had put the children to bed and was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking at paint samples for the bedroom renovation we still hadn't started. I sat down across from her, and she looked up with a smile that faltered when she saw my expression. "I need to talk to you," I said, and watched as her face changed, as some part of her that had perhaps been sensing the shift in me for weeks suddenly understood that whatever I was about to say would change everything. She set down her teacup with careful deliberation, her hands steady despite the way her eyes had begun to search my face for clues about what was coming. We sat there in the fluorescent light of the kitchen we'd shared for 12 years, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of our life together. Photographs on the refrigerator, school schedules on the bulletin board, the comfortable clutter of a family that had built its routines around the assumption of permanence. "I'm not happy," I began, the words feeling both inadequate and enormous. "It's not about you. It's not about the kids. It's not about anything you've done or haven't done. But I can't keep pretending that this is enough for me." The conversation that followed was punctuated by tears, by anger, by long stretches of silence during which we both tried to understand how we'd arrived at this moment. She asked questions I couldn't fully answer, demanded explanations for feelings I was only beginning to understand myself. I didn't tell her about Lucas specifically, didn't give her the details that would have made the betrayal feel more concrete, and therefore more devastating. But I didn't lie either, didn't try to soften the reality that I was asking for something that would fundamentally reshape all of our lives. By the time we finally went to bed that night, exhausted and hollowed out by the weight of what we'd acknowledged, we both understood that there would be no going back to the careful fiction we'd maintained. The conversation would continue over the days and weeks that followed, through tears and arguments and the slow, painful process of untangling a life we'd built together. But the essential truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. The garage felt different that evening, emptier somehow despite containing all the same tools and projects I'd accumulated over the years. I stood in the center of the space that had been my refuge for so long, a small overnight bag at my feet, and tried to memorize the details I'd taken for granted. The workbench where I'd spent countless hours fixing things that could be fixed. The pegboard where every tool hung in its designated place. The fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh, practical clarity. On the workbench, my wedding ring sat next to a folded piece of paper with Evelyn's name written across it in my careful handwriting. The note was brief, inadequate for everything I wanted to say, but the best I could manage. An apology that could never be enough. A promise to take care of the practical details, to make sure she and the children would be financially secure. Words that felt hollow even as I wrote them, but necessary nonetheless. The ring looked smaller than I remembered, a simple gold band that had felt so significant when I'd first slipped it onto my finger 12 years ago. Now it seemed like an artifact from someone else's life, a piece of evidence from a story I'd been telling myself about who I was supposed to be. Outside, summer cicadas filled the air with their persistent drone, a sound that had always marked the deep heat of July evenings in our suburban neighborhood. Through the small garage window, I could see the house where my family was sleeping, where Evelyn lay in the bed we'd shared for over a decade, where my children dreamed their innocent dreams in rooms I'd helped paint when we'd first moved here. The conversations with Evelyn over the past 2 months had been the hardest thing I'd ever endured. Watching her move through the stages of disbelief, anger, bargaining, and finally a kind of exhausted acceptance that felt more devastating than her tears. Explaining to Sarah and Michael that Daddy was moving to an apartment across town, that they would spend weekends with me, that this change didn't mean I loved them any less even though I knew my actions suggested otherwise. There had been moments during those weeks when I'd almost convinced myself to stay, to bury what I'd discovered about myself, and try to return to the comfortable numbness of my previous life. But every time I considered backing down, I would remember Luca's words in the garage months ago. "You're not the kind of man who can keep living in half-light." He'd seen something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself. I heard the car before I saw the headlights, the familiar sound of an engine slowing as it turned into the driveway. Through the garage window, I watched as the headlights swept across the familiar landscape of my former life, illuminating the mailbox with our family name painted in neat black letters, the small garden Evelyn had planted along the front walk, the tricycle Michael had left abandoned on the lawn. The engine shut off, and I heard the soft thud of a car door closing, then footsteps on the gravel driveway. I didn't move from where I stood beside the workbench, didn't go to meet him halfway. Instead, I waited in the fluorescent light, surrounded by the tools and projects that had defined this space for so many years. The garage door creaked as it opened, the same sound it had made for years, but somehow more significant now. Lucas stepped inside, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across the space that had witnessed so many of our careful conversations, so many moments of almost touching, so many words that carried more weight than their surface meaning suggested. He was dressed simply, in jeans and a t-shirt that looked soft with age, his hair slightly mussed from the drive. There was something different about his expression, a seriousness I'd rarely seen before, as if he understood the magnitude of what this moment represented for both of us. Neither of us spoke initially. The silence stretched between us, filled with the distant sound of cicadas and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I felt the weight of everything I was leaving behind, everything I was choosing instead, everything that remained uncertain about the future we might build together. When I finally exhaled, it felt like releasing breath I'd been holding for years, maybe decades. The sound was audible in the quiet garage, a long, unsteady release that seemed to carry away some essential tension I'd carried in my chest for longer than I could remember. A smile began somewhere deep inside me, working its way to the surface despite the gravity of the moment, despite the complexity of what lay ahead. It was the first genuine smile I'd felt in months, free from the careful performance that had characterized so much of my life until now. Lucas stepped closer then, close enough that I could see the relief in his eyes, the understanding that we had both crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. He reached for my hand, the same gesture that had started everything between us. But this time, there was no pretense of accident, no careful maintenance of boundaries that no longer existed. Behind us, the fluorescent lights cast our shadows against the garage wall, but for the first time in years, the shadows seemed to be giving way to something that looked remarkably like light.